Greetings, welcome to the pre-concert chat for our next Victoria Symphony concert airing on December the 10th. I'm your host, Bob Fraser. Well, first off, one of my friends told me that he watched my pre-concert talk for the last concert after watching the concert itself. And to that I say, go ahead. Some of you might find this information more relevant and more interesting if you've heard the music first. In fact, I presuppose a lot of the time that some of you will have heard this music before when I prepare these talks. An obvious exception to this, of course, is when we do a world premiere. This is one of the upsides of having your season online like this. You can watch these things A, more than once, and B, whenever you want. So I say, go for it if you find this information more useful to refer to after the fact. And for this concert, that might actually be the case. I say go for it. For this concert, we welcome back our music director emerita. We're one of the few orchestras in the world that has one of those, and that's Tania Miller. This program features 3 of the most popular works written in the last century in our neighboring country, the United States of America. Now, I had to do a lot of digging to decide how to pronounce the main work, which gives the title of this concert. Is it Appalachian Spring or Appalachian Spring? Apparently, a lot of the people who live in that region pronounce it Appalachian. This is supposedly a big deal. Anyway, the musicians of the Victoria Symphony have a particularly fond memory of touring with the full orchestral version of Appalachian Spring in 2016. When Tania conducted it in 3 locations here in BC and 3 in Eastern Canada, Quebec City, Toronto, and Ottawa. It was the first time the Victoria Symphony had ever performed in Canada outside the province of BC. Now, we had previously only done one other tour on this scale, and that was to the United States. So it's nice to have Tania back to conduct the chamber orchestra version of this same piece. It's the original instrumentation of this work, which was a ballet, and it was written for just 13 musicians. Now, this was written during the Second World War. It was premiered on October 30th, 1944, and Appalachian Spring got its start simply as Ballet for Martha. It was written on commission for the choreographer Martha Graham. And it was only later that the title Appalachian Spring was attached to it. Now, the title comes from a poem by a poet named Hart Crane. And the poem's called The Dance, appropriately enough, since this is a ballet. In the poem, the Appalachian Spring, it's actually a water source, not the season of the year, as I always thought. So, why am I telling you all this? Well, this brings me sort of to the theme of this talk. I've talked a fair bit about what we call program music in my talks. That is to say, music that has a very specific extra musical reference point. Like, for example, an image, a narrative, or in some cases both of these things. Now, the relationship between a piece of music and its program is sometimes such that you can't think of one without the other. For example, we talked about this with the very first piece in this virtual season, which was Vivaldi's set of concertos, The Four Seasons. The composer got very specific about what he was trying to portray, even so far as writing it in the score. Remember the barking dog indication in the score? So I'm going to pose a question for all you viewers out there. What if you don't know what the program is when you hear a piece? And the music might actually suggest something unique to each individual if it's not associated with something else. For example, I've listened to Appalachian Spring many, many times without any knowledge of the ballet itself, either the storyline or the choreography. And you know, the music stands quite well on its own. The appeal of this piece, I think, lies in its simplicity. And I'm not making a joke here on the fact that the piece uses a melody from the Shaker community known as Simple Gifts. But if you listen to the opening gesture of this piece, just that three-note triad, da, 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 and how Copland spins all of the material out of this. And remember the fanfare for the common man on the last concert with the brass? Well, Copland does pretty much the same thing out of the three-note gestures there in that piece that you hear in this Appalachian Spring. Anyway, I would suggest listening to the performance and then at your leisure, see if you can find the 1959 film of Martha Graham's company doing the actual ballet for public TV. It's fairly easy to find on the internet. And I want to know whether you think the action and the narrative are indispensable to this piece or not. And of course, the famous melody used in this piece, Simple Gifts, I'm sure you all know it. Da, 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 dee, 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 dee. Now, how many of you associate that with Lord of the Dance? You know, Michael Flatley and his gang. So the question I'm asking here is, do these associations help or hinder your understanding or appreciation of the music, or do they give it special meaning for you? Now, I don't think there's a right answer to that question, but I'm always curious to know what the audience members think of these things. Now, the next work on the program, I'm not sure what order these are going to be performed in, so I'm just going to go in the order that I have. Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. Now, this got its start as a work for only 4 musicians. It was a movement from his string quartet, Opus 11, written in 1936. So it's a little earlier than Appalachian Spring. Now, Barber realized this work's potential as a standalone piece right away. And that same year, he expanded it to be performed by a large string section, so adding double basses and dividing the parts up. This work has also entered the choral repertory. In 1967, Barber himself produced a choral arrangement of it, where he set the words of the Agnus Dei from the ordinary of the Mass to it. And those of you who don't know the Mass, that's the text that begins, O Lamb of God, who takest away the sin of the world, have mercy upon us. Now, I would highly recommend listening to all 3 versions of this if you can. The string quartet version, the string orchestra version, which we're going to do, and the choral version. Each one of these gives you a unique perspective on the same piece of music. So again, I'm going to ask the question for you about program music. Does adding the text from a religious rite, in this case the Agnus Dei, does this add something to the work, or does it diminish it somehow? There's no one right answer to this, and I haven't even mentioned the possibility of a work becoming unintentionally associated with a program. For example, a lot of people only know about Barber's Adagio for strings because of its use in the soundtrack to Oliver Stone's 1986 film Platoon, which was about the Vietnam conflict. So is that a positive or a negative, that association? Now, the Adagio is a real masterpiece in my opinion. It's a masterpiece because it somehow conveys the most calm, serene landscape, but at the same time, it builds tension so slowly and to such an intense degree that it almost makes your heart stop at the most climactic moment of the piece. I'd love to be able to unpack the whole thing for you. It would be the subject of a very long video, longer than the piece itself. But there are 3 elements to listen for. There's the melodic lines that move very slowly upward, and I mean very, very slowly. Again, you have to put up with my singing, but that opening gesture in the strings. So it just very, very, very slowly meanders its way up, just little by little. The second thing to listen for is the harmony that underpins that. And the third thing are what we call suspensions. That's when a note, usually a very prominent note, sometimes it's in the top voice, it stays constant while the harmony changes underneath. And when the harmony changes, it creates a clash, a dissonance. Now, interestingly enough, The third work on this program is the earliest work on the program. That's The Unanswered Question of Charles Ives. And it's by far the most avant-garde of these three pieces in its use of three different groups playing at different speeds, so much so that it actually requires two conductors, both Tania and our associate conductor Joey keep it together, and its use of dissonance. But it was written, astonishingly enough, in 1908. Now, nowhere else in the world was anyone writing music like this in 1908. In fact, it wasn't actually performed until 1946. It was 2 years after the premiere of Appalachian Spring. Now, Charles Ives, the composer, he was a fascinating figure. He was from Danbury, Connecticut, home of the newly christened John Oliver Memorial Sewage Treatment Plant. There's a 2020 reference for you. He had his own insurance brokerage. That was his main job. He was a pioneer, actually, in the incorporation of life insurance into estates. And his work laid the foundation of what we now call estate planning, which is a big thing. And he composed music that was way ahead of its time in terms of what we would call modern compositional techniques, what we call polytonality, that is the use of more than one key at the same time, the use of dissonance. Apparently Ives' father would train Ives in music lessons by having him play a melody, say in C major, and sing the same melody simultaneously in D flat major, which is only like a semitone away. So he would train his ears in such, avant-garde techniques. Well, avant-garde at the time. And Ives never expected any of it to bring him fame or money. This was, I wouldn't call him a hobbyist because he was very, very passionate about his music, more so than just a simple diversion. But a lot of his work went unperformed until very late in Ives' life. Now, there are three separate elements in this piece. There are the strings. There's a solo trumpet, which is played by our principal trumpet player, Ryan Cole, and he's performing this from one of the galleries in Christchurch Cathedral. And a group of woodwinds, and they're placed at the back of the church with a separate conductor. Now, Ives himself wrote a program for this. Again, we've been talking a lot about program music. The strings represent what he calls the silence of the druids who know, see, and hear nothing. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what he wrote in the score. The trumpet poses a question. It's a little melodic motive. 7 times, the same thing 7 times, peppered throughout the piece. And Ives calls this, quote unquote, the perennial question of existence. Again, he doesn't exactly elaborate on what that is. Now, the woodwind group, whom Ives calls the fighting answerers, they try to come up with an answer, and in the end they just end up mocking the question itself. And you can actually hear this in the music. They actually repeat the notes of the trumpet question back in sort of a mocking manner. Kind of like a childish retort where your kid just repeats your words back at you, but in a mocking fashion, kind of like, go clean your room, Johnny. That's your kid mocking you like that. Well, that's sort of what the woodwinds are doing to the trumpet later in this piece. The answerers finally give up, and we're left with the question one more time, followed by silence. So again, the question of this program music comes up here too. We could have actually called this concert The Unanswered Question. But would this piece have this kind of meaning for you if you heard it without knowing anything of the program? I'll leave that up for you to decide after you've heard it. Anyway, thanks so much for following these programs. And if you have any questions, unanswered questions or not, or comments, please feel free to use the opportunities provided online. I do miss being able to interact with you live, especially at UVic, where we have a nice quiet room where you can freely ask questions. Until then, enjoy, and I'll see you on the next virtual concert.